Welcome back, YouTube. We are back with Troponin Episodes, episode 31. Friendly reminder, as always, you can like, subscribe, turn on notifications, and if you guys are enjoying this content, we really, really appreciate it if you give us a shout on social media, whether it's on TikTok, Instagram, any of the above. Also, if you guys are interested, First Attachment now has field rations back in stock. Field rations and the Go Pills are both. No, Snakebite and Go Pills are both on sale through Friday this week as well.
Yeah, and field rations also. We had a couple of people complain, hey, why don't you do field rations? And so we added that also.
All right, all the best ones are back in stock then.
Field rations is technically 20% off right now because we lowered the price 10% when we improved the manufacturing of it.
Nice.
We're going to kick off today's episode. We had a friend of ours he asked me about some blood work, and I kind of said, I don't know much about this. However, I know two people that do. And so he was generous enough to share his labs with us, and we're just going to go over them tonight. And you guys can take it.
Yeah, and we'll not use names to protect the innocent and all that, but I guess the gist of the blood work is that it was like a typical lead up to a contest set of blood work, pretty typical compounds and dosings to what you usually see going into a contest, like decent doses, quite a bit of tests and EQ, and then as you approach the show, added things like Masteron, Trend, Winstrol, and some AIs. And all that stuff you typically expect is going to skew your lipid profile, but usually after a few weeks of rebound and then a few more weeks or a couple months in this case of just being on basically a cruise, you would expect things to be all back to normal. But in this guy's case, a lot of things were good, like kidney function was good, glucose was good, but the lipids were still super skewed. It was basically single HDL and pretty high LDL, kind of the opposite of what you would want. So we're just going to try to talk about why that might be. So do you have any ideas, Justin?
Yeah, well, one thing I want to say is the cycle I really like because I had to do a double take to make sure it wasn't my cycle recommendation because it was very similar. And I think I'm going to put that up on Team Troponin to show that, what works, and so, no one, because I didn't coach this person. I won't say who the coach was, but he's a very good coach, well-known coach, was a very, very good competitor. And, like the dose amounts, the dose choices, and when to switch compounds, there's really no secret. And the fact that people really still want there to be one when, time and time again, it's shown what works. It's like you don't have to do the guesswork anymore. Back in the old days, we had to try everything, or trust Weeder, or trust the the guys weren't taking anything, or trust the weirdo at the gym. Now you get to just now you can really see, and so and they're all pretty similar. And because I asked who the coach was, and I didn't see who replied, but someone replied, a different coach, which is who I thought it was going to be, actually, because I've seen that coach use almost word for word my cycle advice in the past. But this is a different coach who I don't believe would do that. But again, it's interesting that all these coaches are very, very similar in the dose amounts and the dose and the compound choices. But the LDL being super, or the HDL being super low, are they still on an AI post show?
Let me bring it back up. That was the thing that I wondered as well.
Yeah, I would think they have to, because it says post show dropped everything except for test and primo and GH for 8 weeks, and then eventually dropped to just like a little above TRT and test and GH levels. I would be surprised if they weren't still doing an AI.
Yeah. And again, I don't want to use names, but I've talked to this guy in person quite a bit, and I think he's one who tends to I don't want to say this in a shitty way. He thinks that he's a higher aromatizer. And if he is, he is. Some people really are. But what I suspect is that a lot of guys, I think that they're high aromatizers just because they really don't like water retention. And if you are used to being on a certain amount of AI, whether it's for a contest or not, and you come off or you significantly drop it in the pursuit of basically better health, you're probably going to, put on a few pounds of water.
Yeah.
And I guess you're not going to look as good, but that's kind of, you can't have everything at once, right?
Yeah, yeah, and it's a perfect storm because you have people taking prep compounds and high doses of AIs, you know, and so you're as dry as you're ever going to be. And then after the show, they're no longer taking prep compounds, and then if they stop taking an AI, they're going to hold water. And of course, they insist that they're sensitive to aromatization when it's really not the case at all. And I've seen blood work many times from people who insisted they were sensitive to aromatase, and their estrogen wasn't out of range, you know, because really, is estrogen nanograms per deciliter? I can't remember what the American units are, but you really need to be, most people need to be above like 200 before they'll get gyno type symptoms. I'll see people in the 150s all day with no nipple sensitivity. But people really, you know, insist they are, and they'll look at, like, their chest will be sore from chest day, and they're sure it means their nipples are sensitive, and so
yeah. And
yeah, I think.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was
going to say I was going to say the easiest, like the quickest way to really kind of get a jump on this is cardarine. Cardarine is the only thing I've ever seen to dramatically change HDL in a short period of time. So much so that my last attempt at a contest, using all the AIs and everything, my HDL was 37 4 weeks post show, and the only thing I could attribute it to was using 10 milligrams. I think I might have done 20 for a little bit of cardarine each day post show. And so I think that's, and I've seen that many times, really, really improve HDL in people, especially people whose HDL is really strongly artificially suppressed from AIs.
I mean, I think it's interesting though, just reading through the email, the plan includes a lot of other supplements, things like fish oil, bergamot, niacin, or flushing niacin, ubiquinol, and then changing cardio to fasted instead of post-workout. So there are all these other, things that are trying to be kind of manipulated in order to improve the situation. How much do you think those variables are actually going to help? I mean, we know that citrus bergamot is one of the things that can help with cholesterol levels, but as far as the other supplements, where are you on that?
Well, actually, if you read a little bit longer, it says swap arimidex to aromasin for estrogen control. So maybe it sounds like they were still on aromasin. Yeah, I mean, I'm not anti-supplement at all, but I think most people, I'm not a fan of a ton of supplements, a ton of health supplements. I think you should, like spot reduce, pick I'm getting a lot of echo. Is the mic close to the
just wanted away from us. Is that any better?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, it was echoing pretty. No, it's still echoing pretty bad. Sorry.
No, you're good. How's this?
I'll cut this out.
I think that's better. So I've seen because over the years I've seen probably over a dozen times pretty severe liver issues in people that eventually we could only really work it down to. They were taking so many over-the-counter supplements.
Wow.
And what do people buy when they're buying general supplements? You buy specific supplements from companies, like you buy a pre-workout or an intra-workout from a company. But if you just want a single product, you just generally go to Amazon or whatever and get the cheapest one, which may or may not be contaminated with heavy metals, or you just don't know, because you're not buying it from, those aren't companies. Those are, I mean, does anyone know any of the names other than like NutriCost and Vitamin Shop? You can go there and there's 7,000 different companies that all produce single product.
Is it like all coming from Alibaba at the end of the day?
Yeah. And so I've seen really bad liver. Like I saw someone with ALT and AST and ALT like over 500. One was over 500. One was over 700. And they were someone who was like really obsessed with their health and using supplements for their health. And they were on every supplement you could possibly imagine. I mean, it was, I don't know, they had to spend an hour and a half every morning popping pills. It was everything. And like, you know, they were worried about dropping that because they thought it was going to get even worse. And of course, when we reduced everything down to just a few things that they needed, the liver enzymes improved almost immediately, you know, and came back down, and we're under 100 within, I don't know, a couple months. And then this is a client who's been a client for almost a decade now, and I don't think they've climbed back up since.
Have you seen a big correlation between clients who skip off-season cardio and clients who have not so great lipids in the off-season?
Yeah. I mean, like, it's funny because we have to like talk about this, but you could take any layperson off the street and say, you know, like, so person A does cardio, person B doesn't do cardio. Would you expect person A to have better blood work? Yes. Yeah. I mean, you know, like we're every single day of the year, we're doing things against our health, you know, for the sport that we love. And so if you don't do anything to work towards improving those things, it's going to slowly track in the wrong direction. You know, I see, because you'll see slowly the liver enzymes get worse. You'll see, I mean, probably because of blood pressure, you'll see kidney function not do as well. You'll see weird things like low, what's the alkaline phosphatase, like that's an indicator of like low zinc or low magnesium. I see that. I don't know why, because I don't think that's ever like if you look it up as a real strong correlation to physical activity or health. But people who like don't do any health work, any cardio at all, I see lots of times have low alkaline phosphatase for whatever reason.
The cardio is kind of a good point on a couple of fronts, because one, it'll definitely improve lipids, at least in my experience, seeing what other people do. But also, if you have a situation kind of like this guy's might be, where you don't want to let your estrogen creep up too high, or you don't want the effects of what might be high estrogen, cardio can play a big role there too. We've talked about this before, but like as I've gotten bigger, water retentions have become, you know, a bigger and bigger issue, and especially because I'm a pretty watery person to begin with. And so not only will cardio help your lipids, like it can dramatically reduce water retention. Like I'm talking, I'll notice a few pounds swing, and it's got to be just water, because the other markers tell me I'm still the same body fat, just from making sure I get, you know, 8,000 or 9,000 steps a day versus being a slug at my desk and only getting 3,000 or 4,000.
Yeah, I mean, you can work it through and solve that yourself just thinking about it. I mean, when you weigh 300 pounds, like we always talk about the vascular system as like a garden hose. You have a lot of water going through your garden hose, you know, to carry that amount, because most of your weight is muscle tissue, which requires blood flow. So you have a ton of fluid volume, and our heart works as a pump, and it disperses blood throughout the body everywhere, but nothing pumps it back to the heart.
Yeah.
You know, and so when you're sitting at a desk all day and gravity is the only force acting on that blood, trying to pull it all down to your feet and ankles all day long, it's going to pool down there, you know. And what does walking do? Forces it into circulation, forces the blood to circulate through, you know, forces some of that water to get sucked back up into the bloodstream, get circulate the heart, filter through the kidneys, and pee out. And Stan Efferding really nailed it with his 10-minute walks. You know, he's like, same with the vertical diet, really like getting to the gist of like. But that's the best thing you can do. I don't like to set a time limit. I usually just like to tell people to just try to take a short walk several times a day in between meals, and it makes a huge difference. And then, of course, actually doing your cardio makes an even bigger difference, because aside from just filtering the water from the movement, improving your cardiac function, because what that water retention is essentially like an acute low form of heart failure. Your heart not being able to keep up with the demands, you know. And so the better your heart is at its function, the longer it'll take for that stuff to accumulate when you're sitting at your desk.
Yeah. As it relates to specifically estrogen too, again, like if your estrogen is actually high, I guess you've got to address it. But I think that what people think is high estrogen is often not. Like, and not just through water retention. Like if you have high water retention for other reasons, such as low activity or poor food choices, I find that can sometimes present as high estrogen. Like I do have a little bit of gyno left over from puberty, and most of the time it doesn't look that bad, especially in prep when, you know, you're depleted anyway. You don't notice it much. But if I let myself get bloated, or if I look at it, after a high day where I barely moved or something like that, then it looks like my gyno got worse over the course of a day or two.
Exact same. Yeah.
And I've heard plenty of other people talk about this. So like, do you feel like your estrogen's higher when you're on high carbs? Like, well, no, your estrogen's probably not higher, other than the fact that over time, maybe you're getting a little bit more body fat, but it will look worse.
Yeah, I lose that that sharp pec line, which is what people want. But that's like when I hold a little bit of water, that's, my lower abs, and that pec line is kind of where it'll kind of store first, which you could easily believe is estrogen related, when it's really just partly because I have a little bit of gyno from puberty as well, and that's one of the areas I hold water, But yeah, and then there's other things you can do. You don't have to use an AI to reduce estrogen. You can. I used to be a bigger fan of Nolvadex. John Meadows and the way he passed makes me slightly less inclined to. I used to recommend it as my go-to anti-estrogen in the off season. There's a higher risk of blood clots, and but I think in general the benefits outweigh the risks. But Nolvadex works to kind of block the receptor, and so that it fills the estrogen receptor and doesn't activate, doesn't make it active. But your body still has estrogen floating around, so you still get some of those health benefits of the estrogen, which is really what you want. That's because estrogen is really healthy. Improves bone density, improves your blood lipids. It just in general, an androgenic blood profile is really unhealthy if you define health as longevity, which is, it's one of the main reasons women live longer than men. That the high estrogen is good for bone health, good for cardiovascular health, good for cholesterol levels, and androgens are bad for all those.
Well, estrogen's also really good for your gains. Like I remember there was that podcast, you were on a table talk with Dave Tate a few years ago.
Mm-hmm.
He talked about how, back in like the early 90s and stuff got really hard to get.
Yeah.
Some guys, they would get the cattle pellets that were mixed with estrogen.
Synovex.
Some guys did not bother filtering it out. And so, of course, they got gyno, but they also had like the best gains of their life.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, every hormone. Well, everyone knows how terrible you feel when estrogen's rock bottom at the end of prep. Your training sucks, your joints hurt, you don't feel strong, like the joints aren't lubricated, everything's tight and uncomfortable. You feel like you're at risk of tearing a muscle every set you do anything. And so, like, why would you want to avoid that as much as possible the rest of the year, aside from the health stuff? I mean, it should be like we say the health reasons that everyone should be like, oh yeah, that's why I want to do it. But it doesn't. The health stuff goes in one ear and out the other ear. But if you like, water retention isn't necessarily bad. Some, if it gets too much and your blood pressure spikes, it is. But water retention helps improve safety of the muscles. The risk of injuring a muscle or damaging a connective tissue is going to be lower. The support around your joints is going to be higher because that fluid compresses. It acts almost like a knee sleeve or an elbow sleeve. And estrogen's not the enemy. You don't want gyno, but the people worry about gyno. Gyno is really obvious. It hurts. Your nipple area it hurts. And even then it has to hurt for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks before it forms into like a large mass. Mm-hmm. And then gyno surgery is easy and quick. I've never had mine done, and mine was never enough to need it. But almost every pro has had their glands removed, so they don't have to worry about it. And no one, you can't tell. And good surgeons, you can't tell that that they've even had it done. And so it's the dumbest thing to really be overly stressed about, because it's not a particularly expensive surgery. It's not ridiculously expensive. You're going to spend more on your prep cycle than you are on that surgery.
Yeah.
And then like, I know no one cares about living a long time because all they care about is, winning their next show. But when the competitions are over, you are going to care about living longer. And having like rock bottom estrogen is just not good. You're not going to live a long life that way.
Yeah. So to bring it back just a bit, I think we kind of went off on these tangents, assuming that the use of an AI might be the problem as to why he has such low HDL in the off season. But I suspect that's it. But let's say it's not. Like, what might be a different reason? If
this was during TRT and he does this, that's a very good point. Brian, you brought that up because I would have just glanced over this. If you do TRT and you don't do like frequent smaller doses, you just do it all in one dose, and you get a big spike of your estrogen will drop really quickly later in the week. It's and I've seen that on my own with my TRT. My estrogen was really low last time because I had my blood work 6 days after my TRT. My test was like 396, which is lower than I expected, but it is what it is. And my estrogen was low 18 or something, really low. And that was what the doctors at Merrick Health, that's what they said. And so I'm saying this is like, I don't know I could probably work through the reasons for this, but it was basically, when you get that surge of testosterone, your estrogen's, you're going to get the aromatization real quickly, but then kind of everything's going to, start acting to work against that. Whenever there's anything happens one way really strongly in the body tries to subvert it. And by the end of the week, so if this was like 6 or 7 days after a single bolus dose of TRT, I can see the estrogen being really low from that.
Is that short a time scale? Like, let's say that they did their TRT shot and their estrogen was much higher earlier in the week. 6 days later, it's low. Is that a long enough timeline for HDL to drop as well as the estrogen?
I don't know, but I would guess that getting HDL up is more work than keeping it down. So if it was already down, I would guess that spending 2 or 3 days with estrogen in a good range, and then 3 or 4 days with estrogen really low is probably all it takes to keep it down, keep LDL really low. But I don't know that's just my guess.
Okay. All right. Well,
hopefully, if anyone's listening in the comments, if anyone is an expert on it, give us your feedback.
Yeah,
I always like to learn.
We've helped our buddy here, but I think for everyone else, a big takeaway is like don't suppress your estrogen, and especially if it's in the pursuit of just like a vanity. Basically, if you want to gain really well and if you want to be reasonably healthy, you need to accept a little water in the off season. Like you can't work all year, and you're not going to be strong anyway. Like, didn't you get into this because you want to train hard?
Yeah, I know. It's like it blows my mind because you hold back your progress. And so for what you're spending on AIs over maybe a 2 or 3 year span, you could just get your glands removed. So just, bite the bullet and do it, and then be strong and big and make progress. Then, you're not going to step on stage with high estrogen. You need to lower estrogen, no water retention. The body, the human body is just more likely, it tries to, the ratio of muscle mass to body fat is linked to hormones. And so, as your androgens go up, your body's going to be more predisposed to holding a high amount of muscle mass with a low body fat. But if estrogen's really high, it's going to reach a point where it's not, if you're on like a gram of test, it's still going to be in favor of estrogen, but it's not going to be so strong that, because women have a hard time getting very, very lean. The average woman is almost 20% body fat, where you could say the average man is like 12%. It might even be higher. I think the average woman might be like 24, like according to the textbooks. I don't know what any of those are anymore, because when I learned all the body fats, it was only when skin folds were being used for measurements, and everything's those were so inaccurate that like my 12% is, I still say 12%. I'm picturing someone with a faint outline of abs, but now you get them with like a DEXA scan or hydrostatic or in-body, and it's totally different. And in-body is terrible if you have a lot of muscle. I've seen people in contest shape measure out at 17% body fat on those things, because it's just, but anyways, at the end of the day, the estrogen does not want you to be super lean. Estrogen's there to keep fat on the body to feed a baby, basically.
Yeah. So I think we're also going to talk about a kind of a supplement related topic, specifically kind of weird variations on the basics. And there's a bunch of ways we could take this. The example that immediately came to my mind was something which I think it's been dropped by most companies because they realized it was just a gimmick. But back in like the mid to late 2000s, there was this thing called creatine ethyl ester.
Oh, yeah.
And, creatine monohydrate, you've probably heard tons of times, it's like the most studied supplement ever. It's not going to do anything amazing, but it is effective. And it's effective for basically everybody. You take a little bit, it's dirt cheap, it's, one and done. But companies started coming out with this ethyl ester variation, and they said that it was, I think, more bioavailable. They made some claim about how it was supposedly, 70-80% better than creatine in terms of what's creatine supposed to do? Increase ATP production.
Increase creatine phosphate stores in the muscle.
And normal creatine is tasteless, and this stuff tasted like absolute ass. It was so bitter. I mean, you couldn't mix it into any drink without it.
You sure it wasn't one glue?
Yeah.
But yeah, people were on this kick for a while, and actually over on Intense Muscle, which was an amazing source of information, I think people on there were on a big creatine ethyl ester kick for a while. So if you ever go to that board and you look at threads from like 2007 and like, what's the CEE product everyone's talking about? All caps, like, oh, that's it. But yeah, that's just one of those things that it didn't pan out to be anywhere near as effective as companies would have liked you to believe.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough because you want the supplement companies to innovate, and there's it, like anything, it's more nuanced than it's not just straight black or white. But like for creatine, it slowly builds up your creatine phosphate stores. So anyway, if creatine gets in your system at all and you can take it every day, you don't need a better delivery system than that. So it's already like optimized. I mean, the only way to optimize it more, because you max out your creatine phosphate stores. It's like a bucket, you fill it with water. And so any creatine will slowly fill it up. And so if you can take it every day, eventually it's going to get filled up. So the only thing you're doing by a new adding an ester or something to it is that maybe it fills up quicker. Once it's full, so you get, if it took 4 days to fill up with regular creatine and it fills up in 1 day with creatine ethyl ester, then you get 3 days of benefit. And then the rest of your life, it's the exact same, And so you kind of also have to think how like the compound works. But there's other things like that, like bioavailable is like, everyone loves that word in the supplement industry, but you still need the results of the compound, And we were talking before we started recording about dihydroberberine, and I see that all the time. People talking about dihydroberberine. It's a higher bioavailability than berberine. And kind of my joke all the time is, no one reads the study. It cracks me up because when people are arguing on the internet, especially on Facebook, they'll post a link to an article, a link to a research article, and it's at best 50-50 that article actually supports their argument, because no one ever reads the articles, because research articles are hard to read. Like you can't just skim them like a magazine article. Yeah. And people just post it trusting that no one will read it. But then dihydroberberine is kind of the same way, because yes, it does appear to be more bioavailable, but what does that mean? It doesn't mean anything if it doesn't improve blood sugar. And it does not appear, I mean, at least in rats, it does not appear to improve blood sugar over berberine. So whatever's happening when it's you're like being more available doesn't seem to correlate to any, improved effectiveness. And so there's probably some dose curve with berberine where, so like 1,500 milligrams of berberine per day is kind of the standard dose. So you would think, well, if I take 3,000 milligrams, it'll be twice as effective. You can't just assume that. And so there's probably some dose curve with that where it isn't that way. And so by having it more bioavailable, it just maybe lower. It doesn't really affect that dose curve so much as there's something going on that doesn't increase the effectiveness.
Yeah. There's some sort of a rate limiting factor, basically.
Yeah, and I'm trying to like word this carefully, because we have Suppressor Max coming out that has something that actually does improve the effectiveness of berberine by over 20%.
But I think that's a good point where, I mean, gosh, even, going through grad school for me, it was like people think they know how to read research, and it's like, no, I really don't. Yeah. It is a skill that a lot of people and a lot of internet keyboard warriors think they have and really don't.
Yeah, because everything's listed in, milligrams per kilogram per day. It's never listed in absolute amounts. You have to take notes, and everything's in acronyms. And so you have to remember what the acronyms are. And there's all these caveats, and then they get to the conclusion, and in the conclusion, there's all these additional caveats, and then it's probably also on rats or mice, and everyone knows, like, if they know, like, the mice problem, the telomere mice problem. Have you guys heard about the telomere problem in mice?
I know the telomere problem, but what's
well, like telomere length is like one of the major things that they studied for why we age, and they use these mice to test all that. And I don't remember the exact story, but like dumbass scientists like that everyone is, they didn't really think about the breeding, where these mice were coming from, and somehow at some point the mice were all bred to have, like, I can't remember exactly what it was, the exact same length telomere, or telomeres that degraded differently than like regular mice. Something happened, they didn't diversify the gene pool enough, and all the anti-aging studies for like a decade now are essentially useless in relation to telomere length, because they were all studied on mice that had this aberration to their telomere length that was directly related to the way they were breeding the mice.
Exactly.
And red mice, cue the banjo music.
I just thought of a really, nerdy analogy here, just talking about the way you have these little studies that study something very specific, and then you have our industry, fitness and bodybuilding, that tries to apply it to a broader context. It's kind of like, if you're a software developer, you appreciate this. You've got unit tests and integration tests. A unit test is when you look at one little component of the system and you test a change and you see what it did, or you make sure that you still get the result you want. And if you didn't, then maybe you broke something. An integration test is when you test the whole thing or a large component end to end. Here's my input, here's my output, 10 steps removed. And I think people who focus too much on these little studies, it's like only unit testing and never really integration testing and seeing what's the real result of making the change that you're studying.
I like that. Because we get all the time, someone would send code and be like, well, it worked on my computer.
Exactly.
You work through the code, and eventually you find where they're referencing C drive, Justin's computer, my folder.
It's like, interesting in PT research too, because I think in our field, it's like, we acknowledge that there's a lot of other stuff that goes on within the human system, and a lot of it is emotional, and that changes the output. And so it's hard in PT research, because you can kind of know that, like, great, here's what we can see, but how true it's going to be across a broad population is kind of a toss of a coin a little bit. So it's always interesting to me to look at, like, comparing something like physiology versus anything that is related to, pain perception, threat perception, placebo, nocebo, all of that. Because the physiology, it's like you have the systems defined, and like you have things that are going to influence those systems, and they're going to be a little bit variable between people. But for the most part, they all kind of operate similarly. I'm always...
Well, that's why I like to stick to nutrition. That's why I always say with training, like, I have my beliefs with training, but it's like you get really deep into the quagmire, because emotion and motivation and all those things play such a bigger role. Where nutrition, it's like the food the taste is like the only emotion involved, but like the macros are macros, meat, rice, repeat. Where like training, I like to train heavy. I like progressive overload, and I might believe that's the best program. And I might even be able to reproduce a study in other people who really like to train heavy, that for them, it was the most effective training protocol. But that doesn't mean someone who dreads training heavy, whose joints are small, who gets little micro tears all the time, it's not going to be the best program for them.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say, that's why I like the training stuff. Like, I like to have my opinions, but it's like you have to have the knowledge you have to really understand it is so much larger.
And it's wild to me, again, like as a PT, I've spent so much time looking at not just like the biomechanics, and not just the physiology of muscles, and not just the pain science component, which is really like how people operate. It's like you have to see such a broader scope. And I was talking to Chris Edmonds, who wrote me in my program that I'm running right now, and it's so cool talking to him, because it's like talking to like a meathead version of myself.
You're not a meathead?
I mean, I guess a little bit. as I talk to other PTs, and like, well, if you lose your form, you lose. Let me go
square root of my hypothesis.
But what's cool about talking with Chris too is, like, at some point, as much as you might have a way you like to train, you're going to make the most progress if you can stay in the game the longest. And so we talked about, for him and for myself as well, just being kind of small jointed. At some point, even a perfect rep, and we talked about this, even a perfect rep is still joint stress. And so you have to be able to kind of scale things in a way that's going to allow you to progress over time and basically stay in the game. And so I think that's an interesting thing about training too, is you can have all of the knowledge in the world, but the actual application is a little bit of an art of reading the person, and also acknowledging the biomechanics of the situation, like the objectives. So you have kind of like the subjective as well as objective, and they have to meet in the middle on both and kind of sway. There's that gray scale, and finding that sweet spot is such an art, and I think it changes over time so much.
I think trying to find that gray area has kind of been lost in the era of online training. So many people, especially strength athletes, get their coaching from someone who is purely online. They've never been with them in person. In a lot of cases, they're not even looking at video that much. And so all you can do in that context is try to distill things down to a reasonably good spreadsheet or program with percentages or something. And even if it's not percentages, it's, reps in reserve, but you're prescribing that to somebody who may have a completely different concept of failure from what you're intending. And so I think so now you see a whole lot of nerds who want to kind of bypass the whole subjective part and like the learning that it's involved in that, and just come up with some simple rules of thumb.
Or RPE use even, it's like, I think people are better at it now because everyone's using it. But we did a study when I was an undergrad that I think we talked about in one of the episodes that you'd never be able to do again. The changes of RPE and time to exhaustion on high dose ephedrine and caffeine on soccer players, and their RPE was completely useless when they were on 50 milligrams of ephedrine and 400 milligrams of caffeine. Yep. Their heart rate was like 220 beats per minute, and they were saying RPE 6, and it was their RPE, like, because we did a normal stress test. I can't remember what they're calling more, but the typical stress test you do in exercise physiologist, it goes up, in incline and in speed every 3 minutes. And it's when they weren't on the trucker meth, their RPE was really pretty standard. And, when they got to about 80% of their max heart rate, they were reporting an RPE 7 or 8. When they got to 100% max heart rate, they were reporting RPE 9 and 10. But you give them ephedrine caffeine and their heart rate jumps up really quick, and so their heart rate's way above where it was on the previous testing, and their RPE is dramatically lower. And then they run into what would happen with almost every single one of them was they'd get to their max heart rate, because they're college kids, would be about 220, and they'd be at about 220, and they're still reporting an RPE 6. And we're only asking every, I don't remember, 30 seconds or a minute, and before we even get to the next cycle where we have to ask what their RPE is, which they would have sent a 10, they've failed and had to jump off the treadmill, because it caught up to them so quickly. And so even things like that, it's hard to, that's a skill in itself, understanding, because I know my RPE, there's no way my RPE at 2 week measurement at 2 weeks out of a contest is the same as it is in the middle of the off season.
Chris and I joke right now that my RPE is, instead of RAR, we go with RBS, which is reps before seizing.
No.
Because I'll actually, on some of these high rep sets, I will keep going until I actually seize. And that happened training with the GAPS crew, and it happened a couple of weeks before that. And it was happening almost every week for a while. And in managing that, I've had to remind and actually we talked about this with Dave's training too. At some point, you cannot, if you have a baseline strength level and a baseline intra-set endurance level that's relatively high, you can't continue to just beat your head against the wall, or it's going to get harder and harder to basically add a rep or add, 5 pounds or this, that, and the other. So for me, I had to pull back and basically recognize that, I think all the research is showing, a couple of reps on the tank basically still an effective set. Yeah. And for Dave, we had to pull the weight back because with pressing in particular, he'd come in and, try and, hit an extra rep with 405 in his incline press week after week and not hit it. And basically I was like, dude, you drop the weight 5%, you're going to hit 6. Yeah. And he did. And so just being able to kind of really own the 2.5s. And, I think you were saying that Dante basically perpetuated that as well.
Yeah, that was always a Dante Trudeau thing. 2.5s are your best friends.
Oh yeah. Well, I think it's funny. You were kind of saying this. What I was always able to find, and I think it's largely related to the amount of weightlifting, meaning that a 2.5 pound plate added to a deadlift when you're really strong, it's such a small percentage of the total weight that it's almost negligible. Where on things like biceps or triceps, like you're doing a dumbbell curl and you can only jump up in 5 pound increments. That might be 30% of the total weight, But I always found that I could really linearly, progressively overload squat, deadlift, front squat, rack deads, because, adding a 2.5 pound plate on a 670 pound deadlift doesn't change it, and so you have several weeks. So you might have good and bad weeks in that process before it catches up with you. But on bench, I stalled, or any pressing movement, I would stall really hard for a long period of time. And the only time my pressing really, really dramatically increased in strength was when I did powerlifting, and I was leaving a lot of reps in reserve and doing a lot of things, just, focusing on working on technique, working on form, or working on specific parts of the lift or whatever, as opposed to just, this is my one set, I'm going, into total positive failure and I need to get this many reps.
Well, I think there's a lot to be said with movement selection there too, right? You take something like a bench, and at some point you're going to be more limited just based on the biomechanics of something like a tricep. just based on, again, anthropometrics versus something like a squat or even a deadlift. Like you lose position just a little bit on the deadlift and you have mechanical advantage to, you know, a centimeter sway, you're probably still going to be able to hit more reps. You don't have that with pressing because you're so much more isolated.
I think it's the size of the musculature involved too, and the number of muscles involved. Because even if you're a strong presser with like, you know, big pecs, shoulders, triceps, you know, if you're using something like a machine press or a Smith machine press, your pecs are probably still the limiting factor. And so even a little bit of weight added is meaningfully more tension on the pecs, I think, compared to a deadlift. Like the tension's dispersed over so much musculature.
Yeah.
You can add more weight and it's not that effective on any one muscle.
I totally disagree with the pressing limitation. I think so many more people are limited in their pressing movements. You look at where they stall, and they don't stall in the range of motion that's pec dominant. They almost everybody misses reps because they stall in point of motion where they're transitioning from pec to tricep. And you think about it, and of course, like if someone is like, that's a large group of muscles through the bottom range versus like really basically tricep, maybe a little bit anterior delt through the mid range. So I think that's where, you know, programming, whether you're training for strength or hypertrophy, can still be very strategic to where should you be hitting some heavy tricep work that's not just isolation, it's probably going to carry over to your pressing. So you're not artificially limited, losing reps off of your chest training because your triceps are the limiting factor. Absolutely. But I think that's good. I think that's kind of a blanket statement. I don't know how accurate it is.
I like it.
Well, I know, Justin, we're getting close to wrap up time here. But again, guys, we really appreciate your support. If you have any questions, comments, drop them below. Those of you who have asked questions below, we try to get to that content on the Team Troponin site. Again, like, subscribe, check out First Attachment for sales going on. I'm going really
go to Team Troponin if you want to see this cycle that a very high level pro coach gave, that I like because it's almost identical to what I usually recommend.
Yeah.
All right, guys. Thanks for tuning in. We'll catch you next time.
Yep. See you guys.